Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on budgeting for smart buildings when you're in a global crisis. A couple of housekeeping things here. One is if you have any questions, all of the participants are on mute, but down the bottom you'll see that there's a chat session and you're more than welcome to type a question as we go into that text box, and we'll save those questions for the end. But it might be helpful if you put those in as you go. Also, we're recording this session, so everybody who's registered will get that emailed out to them after the event, probably next week. So everyone is in the middle right now of a global pandemic, and this is a very topical subject. How do we budget for a global crisis, and how, when you're in the middle of a global crisis, do you adjust your budgeting? But it's a pandemic, right? And within 18 months or 2 years, we'll be through this, and it'll be just a historical blip in our memory. But we actually believe that with climate change and rising sea levels and more extreme climate events, that we're actually going to see many more frequent cases and much more serious crises. And we've actually seen that over the last quarter. Venice witnessed their highest aqua alta in over 50 years. Australia had extreme bushfires through December and January, and Northern Europe had Storm Dennis. And then all of that was followed almost immediately by coronavirus. So we think it's a really useful subject that we're talking about today, and we're going to move on to our introductions because we're extremely privileged today to have a couple of smart building experts with us. We have Susan Clarke, who is here from Verdantix, and we have David Gallagher, who is here from Oxford Properties. And both Verdantix and Oxford Properties are companies that Switch has we've been dealing with and had strong relationships with both of these companies for more than 5 years. And both of these companies are at the very forefront of thinking about digitization of our industry. So I'll welcome Susan Clarke to introduce herself and just what her firm does, and specifically her role, but also how did she end up being in the area of smart buildings. Welcome, Susan. Susan, I think you might be on.
Thank you very much, Deb, for the introduction, and it's great to be joining the session today. I'm a research director at Verdantix, and we're an independent technology analyst firm looking at the digitization of the built environment, and also looking at the kind of digital tools to enable employees to have a better experience within their building. And at Verdantix, we're not just looking at high-end buildings. We really believe every building can be smarter. And actually, Deb mentioned a kind of an interesting point there, kind of how did I end up in this role, producing research on the smart building sector. And actually, I got involved in the smart building sector around 10 years ago, after studying sustainability at university. And I became very interested in how the sustainability agenda could intersect with building management. So for the past 10 years, I've been looking at smart buildings in terms of the way that we can use technology to reduce the environmental impact of buildings. But that agenda's become much broader, and I've been covering lots of different related themes, whether that's cost management, resilience, or well-being.
Excellent. Fantastic to have you joining us. And David Gallagher, who is the National Programs Manager for Oxford Properties. Oxford is definitely one of the forward-thinking companies in this space. We admire very much the way they think about things. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me, Deb, and everyone on the call. So I'm the manager of Smart Buildings Technologies at Oxford Properties. I work out of our platform services group. For those of you who aren't familiar with Oxford, we're a global real estate organization. We own, manage, and develop properties around the world. Last time I checked, our value is at about $100 billion in assets. And my role comes down to working with our properties primarily in Canada and the US. And I'd say about a third of my role is related to developing our smart building strategy and refining that as new technologies come about. A third is related to the implementation and deployment of technologies. And I'd say the other third is just helping our sites to utilize that technology to operate more efficiently. One of our big platform smart buildings projects that we're working on is the deployment of the Switch Automation Analytics platform across our Canadian portfolio at the moment.
And how did you end up in smart buildings, David? Was that by accident or by design?
I think a bit by both, to be honest with you. So I've been at Oxford for about 10 years now. I'm an engineer by training, and when I first started, I started off in our sustainability sort of group within platform services. Was known as national programs at the time. So when I started, our sustainability program was just in its infancy, and I really helped to build out our energy management program into what it is today. A lot of that dealt with installing metering infrastructure across all of our buildings, and then connecting that data from those meters to analytics software, which we would then use to look for efficiencies in where to reduce consumption in our buildings. So I'd say that provided the foundation for getting into smart buildings. And then probably around 5 to 7 years ago, this topic of smart buildings started to emerge. And I was able to transition from the energy management role I was in at Oxford to the role that I'm in today. And certainly I'd say data and utilization of data is key, or one of the keys to our program today. So got a good foundation with the data from my days in energy management and sustainability.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. I think it's one of the hottest careers for the next 10 years. So, and I think you almost certainly agree with me on that, there's just not enough people in this industry. And I'm sure a lot of people that are on the call today are engineers and people that are involved in the industry. And I would encourage all of you to learn as much as you can, because there really is not enough people to grow this industry as fast as all of the projections are forecasting. All right, so let's jump in. I'm not going to bore any of you with an explanation of what is smart buildings. We all acknowledge that this is all about the connectivity of systems and the digitization of data. And I have a very personal view that there's no such thing as a smart building. I'm sure David probably disagrees with me on that, but at Switch, we actually believe that buildings can all be smarter if we get them all connected. But the reason that we really want to get that connectivity is so that we can make services and the teams that manage buildings to be smarter. So it's really for us, and our vision is around making those teams smarter rather than just smart buildings. But this is a session on budgets. So let's look at COVID, the world of budgets for smart building technologies. And we happen to know quite a lot about this subject because it's actually crucial to the success of companies like ours and the entire PropTech ecosystem to absolutely understand how the budgets are put together for buildings. So here's some things that we know about budgets for technology in buildings. Often there is no budget. It's a brand new category, it's a brand new technology, there's no historical spend, and so there just simply isn't a budget at all. And then the second thing that often happens is that the budgets for a portfolio of buildings is almost always with each building. There's no central budget, and I'm sure David will talk to that later when we grill him in the questions. Then not all companies have rolled out technologies at scale. So there's no real clear evidence of an ROI. So there's a big question about what is the return going to be. And so it's difficult to allocate a big budget for a program where there hasn't been a demonstrated case study in the market. And the people that are charged with implementing smart building technologies have often not done large-scale rollouts before. So they actually are challenged in terms of just the procurement and how you go about buying technology. And finally, the incentives. Historically, there just hasn't been enough incentives for companies to create the right budgets to put smart building technologies in place, which I actually think is where COVID and climate change and these other recent or near-term crises are going to come into play. And I think what COVID has done is specifically highlight how smart building technologies can help with risk, resiliency planning, and protecting your brand. So how it does that is reducing energy, obviously, by being able to immediately hibernate a building, protecting your team, which often is, especially in a case like COVID, that is first and foremost in most managers' minds, is how do we protect our teams? And being able to manage your assets remotely certainly allows you to do that. And then something that people don't necessarily think about is brand management. So making sure you're not the only building in the city that's got your lights on. So in short, in the middle of a crisis, you're going to highlight the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of what you might have done if you'd budgeted and been prepared. So I'm going to hand over to Susan. She's done, her firm and herself has done a lot of research in this area and talked to a lot of companies in the middle of this crisis and has an enormous amount of information to share with you. Welcome, Susan.
Great. Thank you very much, Deb, for setting the scene there. So I'm going to be contributing to this webinar by exploring why and how you should be adjusting your facilities management budget during a global crisis. And I'm going to be making the case that you should be adjusting your budget to make room for digital technologies that can support continuity now, but more importantly, build resilience for the future. At Verdantix, we very much see that action taken now can help you be more prepared for future crises. And as I'll discuss later in the session today, these are really becoming more frequent and more severe. And you may well be thinking, my facilities budget is already stretched to the max. Can I really fit technology into this? And what role can it take? But as I'll be discussing later in the session today, it's about thinking about the very targeted investments that you can make, which will really save you wasted resources later along the line. And I'll be contributing to this webinar, drawing on lots of recent Verdantix research. And as I've mentioned, we've been covering the real estate and facility sector for around 10 years now. So even before the pandemic, what we saw through our research is that facility managers were always working to balance a broad and changing agenda. When we interviewed over 300 facilities executives in 2019, we heard that one of their major objectives was to improve the comfort and well-being of staff. They were looking to provide the right conditions for employees to be productive at work. And what we're seeing today is actually well-being is still an important theme. In the past 2 weeks, I've been running lots of research discussions with facility managers. And what I'm hearing from them is that they're now looking to put in place new lines of defense in their building to keep workers healthy when workplaces eventually reopen. We've also seen that cost control has been another long-running objective for facility managers. And as I'll be discussing later today, this is another theme that's really come to the fore amidst the current economic downturn. But what we've seen following COVID-19, which was declared a pandemic in January by the WHO, is that facility managers have really been forced to take a role in crisis and business continuity management. Depending on your sector and where in the world you are, you will have had a very different experience. Generally, what we've seen though is that facilities enabling critical public services have remained open through the pandemic. So food retailers, food distributors, healthcare facilities, and some manufacturing sites. And in these sectors, facility leaders have really needed to take a new role in coordinating infection control, whether that's screening the health of visitors coming into the building or ensuring that cleaning happens more regularly. And we've also been hearing that engineers have been revising the operation of HVAC to increase ventilation into occupied spaces. But what most businesses have really been managing in recent weeks is the need to shut buildings, whether that's entirely close them down or make them kind of still accessible to tenants. And that's created some new challenges in building management around how to close buildings down so facilities are kept safe and firms can avoid wasted costs during lower occupancy. And that's been really challenging for those buildings where lots of processes are still entirely reliant on on-site personnel. So what I've been seeing through some of my own recent research and interviews with kind of heads of facility, workplace managers, and some real estate investment trusts is that the current crisis has really been highlighting weaknesses in business and building resiliency strategies. If we think about it, the sudden and seismic shift to home working has caused many employers to scramble to offer their staff tools for video calling or instant messaging. I've spoken to some large consulting firms that have had to reimburse employees for new hardware and home office furniture. And that's because their employees didn't have the right kit in the first place. I think what's been discussed a little bit less is that some property managers have really struggled to manage their buildings in the midst of the lockdown. And on the screen, I'm sharing with you a few quotes from some of my recent interviews. But we can see some of the challenges that firms have faced have been around closing buildings, ongoing management, or even maintaining income. And just to highlight one kind of really impactful quote, a facility manager told me, "We have been caught by surprise and we've had to scramble to close our buildings." And often that challenge comes when building systems are managed through a set and forget mentality. They've been set around preset schedules and they don't have sufficient flexibility within the current situation. And I've also been hearing from some facility managers, they don't have the tools to manage their buildings while off-site. And this means they can't tell whether their building is operating inefficiently or if there are other problems such as water leaks or intrusions. So why is this? I'd like to kind of look at some of the Verdantix data and dig into this a little bit more. And what we've seen through our own research is that very often facility managers do not have in place the tools to manage their buildings in a crisis. Many buildings are still reliant on on-site personnel. And on the screen, I'm sharing with you an extract from our 2019 global survey with over 300 real estate and facilities executives. And what we saw through this set of interviews is that 92% of firms do not have an IoT platform in place across all of their sites. And that means they lack both a remote view of their building systems, but also a granular view into how their building assets are performing. And I continue to speak to firms that are struggling with manual building systems which aren't connected to the internet. And it really does feel as though this approach is not fit for purpose during a crisis. And it's very likely that these types of firms could be leaving the lights on or HVAC running as normal. And another point that came through this panel of interviews is that 80% of firms do not have workplace management software in place across all of their sites. And I really believe that this is going to make it challenging for these firms to consistently roll out new processes or controls at workplaces when they do reopen, whether that's social distancing or new protocols related to screening visitors. So, while the current pandemic may feel like a bit of a black swan event, I think it should really be understood as part of a continuing trend of shock events hitting businesses and livelihoods. And this was a point that Dev made at the start of the webinar. And on this screen, I've summarised some of the major events from the past decades, but this list is by no means exhaustive. And kind of just to highlight a few of these to you, in 2012, there was Superstorm Sandy. This was an extremely destructive hurricane, and it caused power outages to over 8 million customers over 21 states. And this really highlighted how fragile the power system is within storm events. There was also Hurricane Irma in 2017, and this was again a hurricane that caused significant damage. There was also lots of disruption to businesses. For example, Walmart closed 375 facilities and Target shut 122. More recently, in 2019, there were wildfires in California, leading to 10,000 people needing to evacuate their homes. And we also saw power utilities force shutdowns of power systems to prevent new blazes. And this is certainly very much a continuing and accelerating trend. Scientists at NOAA, which stands for the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, generally expect more of this in the future. They have published research predicting that sea levels will continue to rise, tropical cyclones will be more frequent, and the proportion of cyclones reaching categories 4 and 5 will increase. So, what should your smart building action be amidst the current crisis? And I'm just going to set out a few ideas for how you should be thinking about your smart building action plan. But really, the point is that firms should be thinking about taking action now to support business continuity right now, but also build resilience for future shock events. And I'd actually like to take a little step back. In the very immediate aftermath of the pandemic, so thinking about the end of January and beginning of February, the main advice that Verdantix was providing to businesses was to leverage and reconfigure technology that you already have in place. And that's because in the midst of a crisis, it's not necessarily the best time to be totally refreshing your technology landscape. Firms have also been putting in place some very targeted technology solutions that enable near-term continuity. And I'm sure many of you on the phone have been implementing new video conferencing tools in the recent weeks. But kind of what should you be thinking about now? And what we're seeing is that right now, many businesses are starting to settle into a new way of working. And we actually think it's a great time to be reviewing your smart building strategy. You should be thinking both in terms of any weaknesses that you need to address, and potentially these are weaknesses that have been highlighted by COVID. For example, can you remotely monitor and manage your buildings? We also think you should be kind of taking some actions to build resilience against future shocks. And it's very likely that in the future, buildings may need to be evacuated, whether that's because of future lockdowns or kind of further weather events hitting certain regions. So what technology should you be thinking about? Well, actually, a few weeks ago in April, Verdantix polled 50 people and asked them what technologies will play the most important role in helping real estate executives respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And what we can see from this data is actually firms are thinking about lots of different types of technology. 54% of firms, very interestingly, are looking at workplace sensors. What we're hearing from firms is that they're looking to more precisely measure the levels of people in their building or capture data on indoor air quality. And actually that data now feels like it's no longer nice to have data, but must have data. And we also saw from our poll that firms are thinking about an internet-connected building management system, given the advantages of gaining better control and insights while being off-site. So clearly there's lots to think about. Where should you be focusing your attention? Well, one group of technologies that Verdantix has seen to be highly valuable is remote management solutions. These can support with resiliency, but also cost efficiency. And for that reason, we believe they will be a much easier sell internally versus an investment which only gives you resilience. Remote management technology, what is it? Well, as shown on screen, you can see that this is a group of technology solutions which can support off-site building managers or engineers with monitoring, optimizing and fixing assets, very much often through a cloud-connected building management system. There's also other categories of remote management, so you can enable your off-site teams to get alerts on water leaks. And we're also seeing some propositions around remote security management through video analytics. But I think the point I was making here is this is a technology category that was highly valuable even before the pandemic. We've seen in the retail sector, firms have used this solution to enable up to 70% of their faults to be diagnosed remotely. And that's really valuable. You can send the right engineer to site or even direct an on-site intervention over the phone. Generally, if we look at case studies right across the market, firms have used remote management to help drive a 20% reduction in energy usage, or even reduce maintenance spend by 10 to 20% as less technicians are coming onto site and they are more prepared when they do arrive. And actually, if we think about it, remote management can really be a key tool for managing buildings during an emergency. Think of it as your remote window into your site and portfolio. And in some cases, you can actually reset and control your assets while off-site. And clearly, these are very valuable tools, whether it's a lockdown event because of COVID or whether your building has been evacuated because of a weather event. So, to round off my section, I'd like to share with you a few practical tips around how you can get digital technology into your facilities budgets. And we'll be discussing many more tips in the Q&A session later. Kind of one tip that I think people should be considering is around how you create urgency and need for your proposed investment. I think with the current situation of COVID and future lockdowns likely, you could think about pitching your investment idea as a lever for improving resiliency during future lockdowns. We think it's also important to wrap together the resiliency argument with the efficiency argument. So if you're able to pitch your technology proposal as supporting resiliency alongside efficiency, we really think it will be an easier sell internally. My second tip is we think you should be really exploring whether you can use a zero capital optimization strategy, whereby you're making better use of your operational systems already in place. And we believe this can be a really attractive option right now, where many firms are really focused on minimizing large capex investments. And as an example, facilities optimization management software is a good example of this. It can help firms analyze building system data to identify opportunities to recommission existing systems or change maintenance regimes. And then my final tip is that you may want to think about tapping into a more strategic or larger budget. What we heard through our global survey of over 300 corporate respondents in real estate and facilities roles is that the majority of them told us that they could get a technology project funded when they were successful in tapping into a centralized real estate budget. And we also heard from the same panel of interviewees is that other contributors in some instances also included a centralized IT budget. But what's really important here is when you're looking to tap these more centralized and more strategic budgets, is that you need to really make your project sound strategic. And in many ways, that may require you to build a narrative around your proposed investment. And right now, a narrative around business resiliency really feels perfect for that. So before I wrap up my section, I thought I would leave you with something to think about. As I discussed and made the case, there's now a really established trend of environmental disasters hitting businesses. There's been lots of these events in the past decade, but the problem is many firms have still failed to prepare for the next storm to hit. There was a really interesting article recently by the economist Tim Harford, where he was expanding on the book called Predictable Surprises. And he was arguing that very often people do nothing in the face of danger. And he stated, the problem is that faced with clear risks, we still fail to act. And in his analysis, he was citing hurricanes continuing to hit New Orleans and other health pandemics failing to drive action. So following COVID-19, I'd like to ask, will it be different this time? Will firms really act in response to this major pandemic? And my assessment is actually many businesses will not act, but the ones that do decide to put in place more resiliency could actually be positioned to gain a bit of a competitive edge in the future and even benefit during the next economic upturn. So lots to think about there. So I'd now like to hand over to Deb as we move into our panel discussion Q&A.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was so interesting and so many fabulous points that you brought up there, things that we see and hear every day, particularly that bit around using and leveraging the technology that you already have. That's, I think, paramount and often a way to get some really good and easy, quick wins. You don't necessarily have to go out and do a brand new installation. And that centralizing of the budgets, I think, is also critical. So let's ask David a few questions now about real life operating in the middle of a crisis. So David, we know that Oxford is one of the most forward-thinking companies in our space, but perhaps you could share a little bit with the audience around how Oxford thinks about budgets. Do they centralize their budget and create that central technology budget? And then planning in the middle of a crisis, how well did those budgets serve you? Because this was a crisis that we all saw coming from afar. I think a lot of us didn't really think it was coming to our shores. And then when the realization was, it was quite rapid, even though, you know, it unfolded slowly at first, and then all of a sudden it was quite extreme and quite rapid. So I'd be really interested in whether those budgets actually served you well in the middle of all of that, or did you have to make changes on the fly?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer your first question. At Oxford, it's all site-based budgets for the most part when it comes to smart buildings technologies, and we do work closely with our sites throughout the year to review their capital plans, to take a look at the plans they have for technology, and ensure that they're, you know, following through on those plans. I would say, you know, in terms of your second question about adjusting budgets, yes, this, you know, pandemic has certainly come at us out of the blue and has hit us. And I think not unlike others, we are facing pressures now to cut costs for all non-essential services and technologies and to defer capital into the future. I would say in our case, you know, we've been at the smart buildings initiatives for a few years and we have a fairly defined strategy. So I think we have the benefits that our organization understands the value of technology, and we've been able to prove the value with certain technologies like Switch, for example. So, you know, I hope that there is still an appreciation for the value that technology can bring as we come out of this crisis as well.
And what were your immediate kind of reactions, you know, as this crisis unfolded, and what roles did tech play in helping you to adjust with that? Like for our company, my first and foremost was, how do I protect the team? And how do we as a team protect our community? So we actually moved to work from home well ahead of when any of the governments in the countries that we operate advised us to. We went early, and that was really, I suppose we were quite knowledgeable about what this meant. It wasn't really about, you know, how many of us were going to get COVID. It was how overwhelmed our healthcare systems were going to be. I'm sure you were thinking about the same kind of things, not just for your teams, but also probably a lot of your tenants.
Yeah, so I mean, on our end, it was literally, you know, we were fully operational one week, and then the next week we were having to shut buildings down. So, you know, I can't say that's something that we've ever planned for before, but I would say just given our investment in technology in the past, we were able to adapt and do that, you know, in a very agile way and very quickly. So, for example, about 5 years ago, you know, we all went from desktop PCs to laptops. And in terms of operational technologies, we've made the investments in base building networks, for example, VPNs, remote access technology that allows our operations staff to log into their buildings from home, essentially. So although it was a change in the way that we operate, I think because we had made that investment in technology, you know, it was a lot easier than not having that technology in the first place. You know, as you can imagine, I think the worst thing is you have a whole roster of operations staff just sitting at home and they have absolutely no access to the building or the systems whatsoever. And at least in our case, you know, that isn't the case.
Yeah. Susan, the research that you do obviously is for people who are forward thinking and, you know, and are planning. But we saw in this particular crisis, a lot of people got caught off guard. I was talking to a retailer that had 400 stores that shut down in one 24-hour period. And I asked them what kind of preparation they did around changing the lighting schedules or moving the setbacks so that they could change, so that they could save as much energy while they were closed. And they actually had done nothing. They literally walked out of every store and locked the doors, and are still in that state. So those all 400 stores are still operating exactly as they were before this pandemic. And I know that some companies are just not going to avail, or don't have the teams to avail themselves of the research. So I'd be really interested in your opinion on whether companies like Oxford have a role to play in helping their tenants to adopt smart technologies.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, I've been constantly hearing very similar things over the past few weeks from people kind of in Europe, the US, Australia, that they really weren't ready to close down their buildings rapidly. And that does mean there are plenty of buildings out there right now where their HVAC is still running around preset schedules. The lighting hasn't been properly turned off, and that's clearly far from ideal right now. We're not just going through COVID, but there's also the onset of a global recession. So that's clearly kind of very unideal costs that lots of businesses are incurring. I think it's very promising to hear a story such as at Oxford Properties, a firm that has put in place technology and is really getting value from it. So I think it's, I know the real estate sector loves to learn from their peers. So I think it's great that David could join us today and share some of his experiences with technology. And actually what we're hearing from him is actually that there can really be a valuable role for technology, particularly at this place. So I would encourage David to continue sharing his success stories of the sector.
Yeah. David, do you think there is a role for landlords to share your learnings and solutions and technologies with tenants? Did you see that? I know you have shopping malls. Did you see the same kind of thing play out where people just had no idea what to do and just shut the doors?
Not on our end, I don't think so. And I'm not at the site level, so perhaps a bit of that did happen with, our shopping centers and tenants. I think what I would say is there will be lessons learned coming out of this for everybody involved, us included. And I think technology is one part of how we move forward, but it's also communication. So, communicating to the tenants what technologies we have in place, how we're able to run the buildings more efficiently to help them save costs, things like cleaning, being able to communicate how frequently we're cleaning the buildings and to what extent, the amount of fresh air that we're bringing into the buildings. All that information is currently within our automation systems. It's been there for decades. No one's really ever accessed it or, displayed it in such a way that it's been meaningful to tenants. But I think coming out of this, we're going to see, not only the push from internally management to communicate this sort of stuff, but also requests from the tenants, because they're going to want to know, is it safe to go in your building? How much fresh air are you bringing in? How frequently are you cleaning the, door handles and escalators and elevators and things like that? So there's definitely going to be lessons to be learned.
Yeah, I think those are going to be interesting KPIs that definitely companies like yourselves that have always been, on the forefront with your comfort index, being able to come up with that index around indoor air quality and the health, the indoor health of the building are going to be helpful for getting tenants back into buildings.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So across organization, there's different appetites for risk. There's different appetites for adoption of technology. I mean, we see that amongst our own family and friends, right? There's always early adopters, and then there's people that will wait until everything's been tried. And so how do you approach that with an industry that's notoriously it can be old school? You've got a lot of people that have been around the industry for a long time. They understand the industry inside out and backwards. They know more than we'll ever know. How do you bring all of those people along in this new world of technology and basically convincing them of that value?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, we could have an hour-long discussion just on that. I would say at Oxford, we've been very fortunate to have senior leadership who just believes in technology. So our CEO, Michael Turner, he's a big advocate of technology. Our new COO, Dean Hopkins, who was hired late last year, he actually comes from a tech background. So if anything, just having the senior leadership understand the value of technology makes my job a lot easier. I think to answer your bigger question, real estate's traditionally been known as brick and mortar, glass, brass, and marble. And, buildings that are brick and mortar just run. But the fact is today's society is going more and more digital, right? So buildings are more than just brick and mortar. They're data, they're systems. And, if you look at buildings from that perspective, it's very important that A, you have the right technologies in the buildings, and B, that they're running, So I think that shift needs to occur. There's also an aspect of, the elephant in the room that nobody likes to talk about is the maturity of our operations workforce. Quite bluntly, I think we did a survey and we found out that a good chunk of our operators, for example, are set to retire within the next 10 years. So they bring a lot of hands-on tools knowledge, but the younger generation that we're seeing brings more of a tech kind of experience and knowledge. So both are important, but the question is, with your operation staff retiring in 10 years, a good chunk of them, do we replace to the same extent with humans, or do we look to technology to help, bridge that gap? And I'm not suggesting or advocating for complete automation of jobs. It's, not what I'm trying to do here, but I think, the industry needs to take a hard look at that and see where technology can help our real estate industry in the future.
Yeah,
it's something we need to start planning for.
Yeah,
right now.
And I honestly believe that's the opportunity, because the people that are retiring are taking those jobs, and those jobs can't necessarily be replaced. Those skills are gone. And so we have to replace those with smarter skills. I mean, where that becomes incredibly encouraging is when you see the new generation of engineers that are running R scripts and, doing JavaScript and Power BI dashboards. It's incredible, the skills that they're bringing. It's exciting. Yeah, and it makes it an exciting career.
To answer your question just more broadly, what needs to occur is the industry needs to see the art of what's possible with technology. A lot of people just jump to technology as a knee-jerk reaction without fully understanding what it's going to do for them, how it's going to solve problems, create better experiences for their customer. I'd say you need to first fully understand the nature of your operations and how you're going to apply that technology and get the value from it. Once you get the value, then it's a matter of communicating that to all of the different stakeholders, whether that be internally, to your operations staff, to management, to your tenants. I think when that starts to occur, we'll start to see a shift within the industry.
Yeah, and that's all part of the budget setting, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what about that sticky problem of the ROI, Susan? How are we going to measure ROI of resiliency? Like it's always the hardest thing for all of us that are involved in smart building technologies, and especially, as I said at the beginning, the ROI is often in doing nothing versus what you did. It's only measured when you're in the middle of a crisis like this that you actually really get the ROI. And risk and resiliency seem to me things that are going to be very difficult to measure the ROI and convey that back to senior leadership.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you on that. I mean, when we think about putting a business case together at Verdantix, we often think about the 3 N's. So we think about need, narratives, and numbers. And to engage your CFO, you always need the numbers part, but sometimes to tap into a more kind of a strategic leader, you also need to bring a narrative around your business pitch internally. I would agree with you. I think it's going to be to put together some very credible ROI numbers around resilience is going to be very challenging. And for that reason, I think if you're able to find a technology investment that delivers across cost efficiency and resiliency, you're going to be much better placed to pitch that internally. So early in the webinar, I was highlighting remote control solutions, which clearly have a role to play during an emergency, but actually without the resiliency angle, that business case can really stack up by itself if you look at the efficiency, whether it's around energy or better efficiency of your maintenance labor. So I think if you kind of keep those 3 N's in mind and try and find a cost efficiency angle, will really help.
Yeah, I agree. Anything to add there, David, on how to measure this? I mean, I think the easiest way is going to be to look at the ratings next year. Who did hibernate their buildings and who didn't, because it's going to show pretty clearly in the GRESB ratings in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think traditionally, based on my experience, ROI has always come down to like a simple payback, and there's many different ways to kind of measure and communicate ROI. I think what I don't see people doing is measuring what's the cost of doing nothing, right? If you were to quantify that, put that into perspective, that would be a huge number. And, you know, we also track comfort, for example. What's the impact of comfort in our buildings? I think some of the benefits of technology aren't always necessarily tangible. You can't put into a cost savings number, a cost efficiency number. So sometimes you have to get a bit creative in measuring that and also communicating it back to, you know, management through your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. For sure, for sure. Sarah, did we have any questions from the attendees?
We did have a few. First one here from David. How do you see the need for a building intelligence quotient or an intelligent index rating system that are complementary to LEED and Green Globes?
Shall I take that one?
You can take that one.
Yeah, so I think LEED did a lot for sort of transforming sustainability in our industry and, you know, getting to that acceptance and adoption. I think, as you kind of alluded to earlier in this call, Deb, what is a smart building? It seems you can ask 10 different people and you'll get 10 different responses. So to an extent, yes, I do see the need for some sort of rating system, you know, that's industry accepted. And I think that will help companies to adopt and move forward and see where they need to focus on with technologies, smart building technologies.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I guess when I think about a smart building, I'm often thinking in terms of the outcome. So are we talking about a building that's using technology to be more efficient, or other things? So with this index, I guess kind of you could risk just measuring how much technology is being packed into that building, and you may start losing sight of the benefits of it. But yeah, certainly an interesting question, and something to think about. But I think it would need to be done quite carefully, so we don't lose sight of why the technology is going in there.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'm much more interested in the results and how we transform the industry. How do we digitize this industry, rather than just another rating system. I've seen so many rating systems that have been gamified, and people just get the results which look nice and shiny on the plaque on the wall, but they don't necessarily get the results that everybody's looking for. And I think in terms of risk and resiliency, that's where you'll come unstuck. Did it really do what you wanted it to do, or did you just get the nice rating to put on the wall?
Great, and the next one here from Pete. For a long time, property managers in the US at least frequently push back on deploying smart building technology for indoor environmental quality by saying, I don't want to know because it makes me liable if it's bad. How are you guys addressing overcoming that viewpoint to implement the technology?
I think that's going to be turned around, and you'll have to have that. If you're going to be leasing Class A real estate in the future, you're absolutely going to have the hard data. That's my view. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. And, you know, the approach that we take isn't necessarily to go full scale from day one. You know, we test it out in a building or two and we monitor the results. We look at all the risks. We let it run for some period of time. When we're absolutely sure, then we scale up and, you know, take that approach with technology. So that would be my advice. You don't always have to jump headfirst into things. Like, try it out and test it out, see how it works.
Yeah, and also actually something I have heard about happening in the UK. There have been a few instances whereby employees are starting to bring their own sensors into the workplace. So if we think about some of these sensors now are becoming so cheap, someone can order their own air quality sensors. So I was talking to an FM services firm that was facing this situation where some employees brought air quality sensors in, and they were getting worried that the employees could start trying to make the case that they weren't in a sufficiently conditioned building. So I guess there is some risk there as a building manager. If you kind of avoid capturing this data yourself, could it be your employees that start capturing it with their own sensors?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at other examples of where industry has broadcast their own KPIs. I mean, the airline industry, buses, trains, all of the transportation, you know, you're much better off broadcasting the KPIs yourself and being aware of what's in those than having somebody come to you with the data, especially if you've got leases that are reliant on it. Any other questions there, Sarah?
Okay, we have time for just one more here from Deborah. What's the pitch to my team that smart building tech is worth investing in right now, while I'm also being asked to cut back overhead by 20% for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that one. I don't think there is sort of like a silver bullet in terms of the pitch. I think, it's more about taking a step back and looking at your bigger strategy and understanding your operations too, kind of marrying those two together. Um, you know, as I said, I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned out of this. And perhaps one way to approach it is, could technology have helped us mitigate some of the risks or some of the, downsides of what we went through? And is it worthwhile putting that in our buildings starting tomorrow?
Yeah, and I think to your point, David, if you start with what you already have, you're not asking for huge investments on day one. If you're starting with your existing building management data or your smart thermostats or the utility data, you can start with a lot of information and systems and devices that you already have without very much investment at all, and then build that case.
Yeah, I'd say, just to add to that, smart buildings is definitely a journey. It's not a one-time sort of event. So you have to be prepared to be on that journey and develop your own roadmap. And yeah, I'm happy to give others tips on that too, if you want to reach out to me sort of after the webinar.
For sure. All right, so I think we better wrap up because we're at the top of the hour here. So we've got some tips here or some takeaways for what you can do. I think the first thing that you should do is, while this is topical and top of mind, is really capture as much information out of this particular crisis as you can, because that will help you build the case for that future budget. And everybody, up till now has been in kind of reaction mode. But I think one of the most valuable things that you can do is collect as many data points as you can around what happened over the last month and what were the costs of not having things in place, so that you're armed well with that to go forward into the next budget season and make that case. So as David said, start from the beginning in terms of the big picture. What are your objectives? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And then appoint a tech champion within your company who understands technology, somebody like David, but can also speak to the business and bring every single one of your stakeholders along on this journey. People will feel threatened by technology. So you need somebody who can put it into terms where they understand it's going to help them and not necessarily just make their job redundant. And then you need to draw a budget from multiple departments, because as I alluded to in that first slide, is you probably don't have a budget today for smart building technology. So you're going to have to draw that budget and make a brand new budget. So where I've seen that really work well is where people have gone to sites and made a case to the sites that they have better purchasing power, and they've clawed some budget back into a centralized budget, and then been able to apply that to the start of their technology. And you're not going to do all of this in year one, as David said. This is a journey, so you don't need to have an enormous budget in year one. Use the data that you already have and the proven use cases to project that ROI against a crisis like this happening in the future. And I think, a really topical question to ask all your senior leadership today, or maybe not today, but the first day back in the office, is, do you really think that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're not going to face a similar situation? Do you think this was a once in a lifetime black swan event? Or do you believe that, with changing climate and rising sea levels and possibly even a recurrence or another pandemic, that we won't face this again, and perhaps we could be better prepared next time? And lastly, position your pitch for the smart building technology as a strategic initiative. There are lots of firms, lots of businesses all across the globe who are using this period of downtime and recession to prepare to come out of this period better, fitter, stronger. And so that is absolutely something that you should be taking back to your senior leadership, is technology can give you a competitive advantage. And so this should be a strategic initiative, just like Oxford have deployed technology strategically. So thank you so much to everybody. Tremendous gratitude to David and Susan for your contributions. Our marketing team will be working hard to behind the scenes to package this up and to get materials out to everybody who registered. And thank you so much for attending. Thank you.